Oh, hello. Well, this is certainly unexpected, but you're very welcome. Oh, that's right. You wanted to come over and learn to play the game. Ah, silly me. No, I didn't forget. I simply didn't remember for a moment. You see, I drifted off for a nap in this warm, beautiful sunshine, and when I woke up, just all thoughts had gone out of my head. Yes, these are the most wonderful looking tomatoes. So golden, beautiful, and ripe. Well, yes, let's go inside and we can get started playing the game, okay? Okay, no, I'm so glad you're here. Let's go. All right. Well, welcome. Are you comfortable? Great. Well, let's get started. I have the One Ring starter set to make it easy for us to learn the game. It has everything that we need, and if we enjoy it, which I hope we do, then we can play the full version of the game. So I'm going to go ahead and get this box open. It is very tightly fitted together. The publisher is Free League, which is a Swedish company. They make a lot of great RPGs. They have, I think, a very nice system with strengths and weaknesses like anything, but it works pretty well. And they have a number of licensed IPs and different games that they produce. But their production value and quality is very high. So it's a real treat opening this up. So we'll take a look at everything we have in here and then go through the basics of the rules so we can get started, okay? Well, there is a bag of dice. Let's take a look at these. So we have 6-sided dice, and there are also 12-sided dice. 6-sided dice are cool. 12-sided dice are cooler. By Spinal Tap logic, they are 6 better than a 6-sided die. So these are customized to help with a couple of mechanics in the game, but you can play with ordinary 6-sided and 12-sided dice because there's it's really just based off of the numbers on the die, the special rules. So we'll look at that when we talk about rolling the dice, okay? And there are some cards in here. These are armaments and armor like a shield, helm, and a bow, axe, spear, sword. So these just provide stats to make it easy to know what you're using. At the start here we won't necessarily use those, but we'll get into them. And then there are these cards. And these we're not going to use in this starter set, really. But they're basically stance cards and roll cards. And you choose, for instance, in combat, maybe you want a forward stance or a defensive stance, and that's going to have some different implications. On the back, it lets you choose some roles that you're playing when you're journeying, like lookout or guide. So, interesting idea to kind of highlight who's doing what. But like I said, with the starter set, not really tapping into that. Up next, we have a map. This is really quite nice. So here you can see we have a map of the Shire, and then a much wider view of Middle Earth. So that's really beautiful and wonderful. So I'm sure that will come in handy. So yeah, that'll let us explore around the Shire or venture out into the wilderness to face who knows what dangers, delve into dungeons or places like the mines of Moria. You know, this talk of adventures and places like the mines of Moria just seems a little bit gloomy in here. I think we could use something to help brighten things up. Give me just one moment. Ah, yes, some fresh cut flowers. Such a lovely fragrance. There, that's a little cheerier now, isn't it? Okay, to get these other contents out, I am going to invert the box here. They fit in so tightly, I don't want to damage the edges. And then you see here in the bottom of the box, there's a smaller version of that wonderful Shire map. So, a nice touch. Okay, so included are some pre-made characters games that might be familiar that will make it easy for us to get started, since you can choose from these options. There are two that I'm going to set aside for another time. But let's see who we have here. We have Primula Brandybuck. She's a cousin of Bilbo Baggins on her mother's side. You might notice that she is Frodo's mother. We have Rory Brandybuck, Primula's brother. Paladin Duke II. Peregrine's father. We have Drogo Baggins. And he will be wedded to Primula and be Frodo's father. Esmeralda Took, Mary's mother. And here we have Lobelia Bracegirdle, the daughter of Blanco Bracegirdle and Primrose Boffin. Lobelia has yet to marry Otho Sackville Baggins. She's about 40 years old and has already seen her ambition to enter Bag End as rightful owner disappear once when Bilbo returned from his adventure against all odds. So I'm going to keep Lobelia handy to show you some examples and help explain the rules here. So we do have a booklet that walks you through the rules with incredibly small print, which is a bit of a challenge. We have a book of adventures, which is where we'll start. It takes place in the Shire, so a nice way to get your feet wet without necessarily risking life and limb out in the wilds beyond the Shire. And lastly, there is this in-depth guide to the Shire. It has all kinds of information and some absolutely beautiful artwork. So that is a very helpful resource for us. Okay, so let's look at the rules. So being a role-playing game, I'm sure most of you are familiar, but if this is your first play, yeah, okay. You're going to take on one of these characters, like Lobelia Bracegirdle, and you'll play that character. I will be your Loremaster, your guide and referee to the world. I will explain events, scenarios, locations that you're in, and you'll simply tell me what you want to do, and we'll sort of have a dialogue around that and evolve the story together. Now, in terms of the game aspect, we do have some stats and some rules. So mostly we'll role play, but there are certain scenarios where I'll ask you to make some rolls, and those will happen when there's more consequential things happening. The rules have a very helpful breakdown of that for an RPG when, danger is on the line, such as in combat, or we try to run across a burning bridge. We would roll to see if you succeed in that outcome. Obtaining knowledge that might not be readily available. If you're digging through some ancient library, for instance. And then also influencing people who are not necessarily cooperative. So you might make rolls then. So let's look a little more into how that works. So your character has kind of three main attributes: strength, heart, and wits, which are pretty straightforward. Strength is all matters of kind of, athletics, but also includes things like song, like a boisterous, powerful performance that you might give. Heart has things like insight and healing and courtesy as associated skills. And wits are skills where you might have to use that noggin of yours. If you're doing riddles or trying to remember lore or trying to persuade someone, for instance. So you have a value, sort of a base value that your character has in those attributes, but really what that does is help define your target number, which is the number you're going to try to beat when you roll. So it's interesting, instead of like strength being something like contributes a bonus to your roll, it's like you might be familiar with some other systems. It actually kind of defines what you have to surpass when you make a roll. So let's look a little more deeply at that. So when you're going to roll, you're basically going to be rolling a specific skill. And they're pretty broad. And it might be applied in different ways. So that's something where typically you'll suggest to me what you think you would use. And if that makes sense, we'll roll on that. So when you go to roll, there are two kinds of dice. And you basically build a dice pool. So you'll probably have more than one die that you're going to be rolling when you have to make a skill check. So when you go to roll a skill check, and let's say we're going to make a stealth roll, perhaps sneak past a wily, alert dog. You're going to roll a feat die, which is the 12-sided die. Okay? You always roll the feat die. Sometimes you might roll more than one in special cases, and we'll talk about that. And the other die, or dice, that you may or may not roll, depending on your character in a given situation, are the 6-sided dice, which this game calls success dice. And so you roll the feat die plus the number of success die equal to the value you have in that skill. So Lobelia has a value of 3 here for stealth. So in that case, could have 3 success die and 1 feat die. So let me move these dice. So as a sample roll, and there's one more dimension to cover, so I'm going to hit that in just a second. Let's do the basics. So 1 feat die 3 success dice. And because this is a wits skill, we have a target number of 12 for Lobelia. So I'm going to add up all my results, and if they're equal to or more than 12, succeed on the stealth roll. Alright, so this was actually a very good example of a roll, because we happened to roll 2 special cases, which works out pretty well. So I have a 6, a 1, and a 3. So together, those are 10. And I have rolled a 12 on the 12-sided die. So that's 22 versus the 12 I was trying to roll. So absolutely crushed it, but in more ways than one. So you'll see instead of a 12, we have the Gandalf rune. So when you roll this on your feet die, you always succeed in your check, regardless of what the total was. So a 12 matches my target number in this case, so just a 12 would have succeeded no matter what. But the rune means that I always succeed regardless of my success dice. Now, say that had been a 10, we still would have succeeded significantly. So that would be a success. Another thing happened, which is I rolled a 6 on this die, and you'll see there's a very tiny symbol, and that's an extra success symbol. And basically, if you roll one or more of those success symbols, you can have a more advantageous outcome to your roll. Now, in the course of role-playing, the Loremaster might identify something about the situation where you get an extra benefit. But when we get to combat, there are some mechanical uses of that, where you can potentially give yourself more advantages or do some more damage, maybe. So we'll look at all that, of course. There's just a little bit more to go into in terms of the roll. That's just about it. There was one other aspect to this skill. So it is marked as a favored skill. What this means is that when you make a skill check with a favored skill, your roll is favored. And basically, if you're familiar with a game like D&D, it would be like advantage. In that case, I would roll 2 of the feat die, and I take the highest result. Okay? Now, I can be ill-favored as well, due to things that may happen in-game. Okay? In that case, I roll the 2 dice, the 2 feat dice, but I take the lowest result. Yeah. Okay? Alright. So, in the end, it's pretty simple. If you're faced with a challenging situation, we'll identify the skill together. You'll roll 1 feat die, plus the number of success dice, equal to the value you have in that skill. And if it's a favorite skill, you'll get to roll those 2 feat die and take the best result. Okay? And your target number will be the target number of the associated attribute. If you get the Gandalf rune, you automatically succeed on your check, regardless of the number total. And if you get one or more of these symbols, you get a more powerful success. Now, last thing on the dice. If your roll would normally be a 1 on a 12-sided die, it is in fact the Eye of Sauron. So, not so good. In that case, this die counts as 0 in your total. Okay, but your success dice still count. It is possible you don't have any ranks in a skill, in which case you just roll the feat die. Okay? Alright, so it's attributes, skills, and how to make a skill check. You already know how to do most of the game. When we get to combat, you just use your combat proficiencies instead of your skills. She has bows and swords as a proficiency. So I'll talk a little more detail there in a moment, but it's basically going to be another skill check using those, and the target number will be a little bit different. Okay? So you'll have some virtues which give you extra bonus abilities you might do. In this case, it gave this character more favored skills. Okay? So, endurance is basically the equivalent of hit points if you're familiar with that mechanic. It does operate a little bit differently, so we'll talk about that in just a moment. But I do want to talk about hope, which is associated with your heart attribute, and hope is basically a resource that you can spend in the game to give yourself some advantage. So Lobelia starts with 16 hope. Okay? And when making a skill check, could spend 1 hope to gain an additional 6-sided die to roll along with the other dice that would be rolled. So it's a good way to help yourself when you really need something to succeed. But as you spend hope, then, you'll have to eventually get that back to keep using it. So the way you can get that back is if you take a prolonged rest. You can take short rests or prolonged rests in the game. That'll give you 1 point of hope back. So it's not particularly easy to regain. And then you gain a value of hope back equal to your heart attribute between adventures. Okay, so it doesn't just shoot back up, so it's worth deploying it when it's most helpful, but it definitely is there as a resource to be used. Okay? There is one other thing that can affect a skill check, which is good to know. Characters have these distinctive features, and these are meant to help you roleplay certain aspects of your character, but it is advantageous to do so because you get some benefits for it. So, Lobelia is inquisitive and keen-eyed. So what you'd want to do with this character is look for opportunities where those might apply on a skill check. So, keen-eyed for awareness. You could imagine, might make sense that, she might spot a, thief in a crowd with that keen-eyed nature. The same with, like, exploring out in the wilderness. Might be able to spot a path, through the underbrush that others might not see, right? So in that case, you become inspired if you're able to use one of your distinctive features on a check. What has inspired me? When you spend a point of hope to get an additional die, you get 2 additional die. So that can be really powerful to be able to use that feature to really maybe tip the scale in your favor on a critical roll. So definitely keep an eye out with the character that you choose, okay? Alright, so we have covered almost everything. It is very simple to play. There's not a lot to track and worry about. So I do want to cover the combat and your fatigue and how that affects you. But before we do that, I really feel like we could use a spot of tea. What do you think? Yes. Let me just grab that. I think that would be quite lovely. Oh yes, here we are. Let me get you some lovely tea. There you are. And some for you as well. I haven't forgotten myself. I'll be back in just one moment with some snacks as well. Wouldn't be tea time without some treats, would it? Right. So, have some lovely tea cakes. And here is sugar and cream if you should need it. And then I have some wonderful cheeses and beautiful ham. So please have some. And of course, some of those wonderful ripe tomatoes. I mean, look at how tiny and wonderful and beautiful that is. Yes, please, have some. Yes, it's all quite lovely, isn't it? Do love a spot of tea. Let's perk you up to play these games. Alright, let's pick up where we left off. We're just about ready to go adventuring, okay? Combat. A wise hobbit may wish to avoid it, which can be a good policy, but it is not always avoidable, even in the beautiful Shire. So, if it does occur, it's basically broken into 2 parts. If you're starting farther away from those you're engaged in battle with, First, there is a round of ranged attacks. So if you happen to have a bow or something like that where you could attack from a distance, you would have a chance to do so. So would your opponents. And it's quite straightforward. Basically, all the players will go first, and then the enemies will go. And then it'll move and everyone will group into close combat, where you'll use your swords and axes and that sort of thing. Or your fists or rocks or whatever the case may be. So, you do your ranged attacks, and we'll do close combat. And whether you're doing a ranged attack or a close attack, you're going to do a skill check, as we've talked about, with the appropriate combat proficiency. So if Lobelia was using her bow, she has 1 rank in it, 1 feat die, 1 success die, and would roll. She would use the strength target number for attacks in combat. So, would need to roll 16 or over in order to hit the opponent. In this case, 7 and 3 is a 10 and would be a miss. Now, you'll notice that at the moment, she's not carrying any weapons, so would want to avoid combat. The strength modifier would be modified by, rather the strength target number, would be modified by the parry value of an opponent that you are facing. So probably will be more difficult to hit than that in some cases. Okay, so it's actually fairly straightforward in terms of the basics of the combat roll. So, and I'm going to want to grab those cards for this. So I wanted to grab one of these weapon cards, since we don't have any gear filled in for Lobelia, to look at some stats. So if you make your attack and you succeed in hitting, you do damage to their endurance equal to this damage rating, in this case a 2 for this dagger. So like I said, it's sort of like hit points, endurances, and that when you get hit by a weapon, then that value goes down. Endurance can also go down because of other strenuous situations, like a very difficult climb up a mountain or something like that. So basically, as you expend energy and are hit in combat, that pulls down that endurance value, okay? So, that's what happens on a check. There's a little bit more to it, as there's a couple things that can happen based on your roll. So specifically, if you get additional successes on your success dice. So that part can be a little bit confusing. It's different than some other games that many people are familiar with, but a number of games do use this mechanic. So basically, make your hit, endurance is reduced by the damage value of your weapon. For a player, there's kind of 2 thresholds. If you go below your load value, like if you're carrying heavy stuff that'll have a load value, you become weary, which has some effects we'll talk about. If you go to 0, you're unconscious. Basically for enemies, when they go to 0, they're out of the combat. Okay? Alright, so let's say you roll at least one additional success on your success die. You can basically spend it or like trigger a couple of different effects. So if you have one success, you can do a heavy blow or fend off. A heavy blow basically means that in addition to the damage you do, you also add additional endurance reduction equal to your strength value. So yeah, you just hit them harder, they take more. Fend off is a way where you basically put yourself in a better position. So you get an additional parry modifier on the next attack against you, so a +2. So you basically can turn that success into being harder to hit. Okay. And the last one is a chance to pierce. And this only happens for swords if you have 2 successes. And for bows and spears, they can do it on 1 success. And basically what this means is if you want to do pierce, you spend that success icon to increase this die roll by 2. Okay? So if you rolled a 10, it would go up to a 12. If you roll an Eye of Sauron, it doesn't help you, it doesn't matter. Okay? So if you get a 10 or the Gandalf rune on your attacks feat die, and so Pierce could help you create that value by giving you those extra +2, right? I wonder if that's a misprint and it should be 11. Then the +2 makes more sense. So, if you achieve that piercing blow by getting that value, then the opponent who's hit has to make a protection check. So, they roll a feat die, and they can add success die equal to their protection rating, which comes from like armor. And their target number, you following me, is the injury value of the weapon. In this case, a 14. So they roll a feat die, maybe their armor gives protection of 1, you roll 1 success die, total those up, and they need to be 14 or higher. If not, they take a wound. Okay? Alright, so what happens if you're wounded? So, if that happens to you and you get wounded, you mark the wounded box. Keep going. Okay? Now, the problem occurs if you are then wounded again. Okay? So if you're wounded again, your endurance goes to 0, you're unconscious, you drop out of the battle. Okay? So over time, you're going to recover from that wound. Basically, between adventures or about a week of time. And someone could do a healing roll to speed that up a little bit, okay? So really what that means is that we're kind of entering into a game here where it is not hyper lethal. You mark that first wound, you can keep going, but if you do get the second wound, then you're in more trouble. But it's not like you're getting your head chopped off in the game. It's not really the vibe that we're going for here. So, it can be a challenge. It's, it can happen. But yeah, we're trying to keep things not so horribly gruesome here. Okay, so that is pretty much everything. I've mentioned endurance. So right, if endurance goes to 0, you're unconscious. If you get wounded, endurance goes down to 0. The other condition is to be weary. So you have a load value based on the stuff that you're carrying. If your endurance drops below that load value, then you would mark yourself as weary. Okay, bummer. Get some rest. Yeah, right. If you're weary, these dice are marked to help indicate this, but it's pretty straightforward if you have normal dice. If you roll a 1, a 2, or a 3, they're kind of outlined versus like the 4 and the 6, which are solid line. Those count as 0 when you are weary, right? So it suddenly becomes a lot harder to succeed on a check, which makes sense. You're tired. So it can be a little bit of a tricky mechanic, but basically, yeah, it turns those 1, 2s, and 3s basically into 0s if you're trying to make a check. So, okay, so how do you get those endurance points back? How do you become unweary if you're weary? How do you get rested, i.e., well, you take a rest. So with a short rest, you get endurance points back equal to your strength. So Lobelia would get 2 endurance points back on a short rest. But if you take a long rest, like a night of sleep, effectively, then you get all of those points back. So that would take you out of that weary condition. However, if you're wounded, you only get points back for a long rest, and with that prolonged rest, you only get your strength value back, right? So until you get over that wound, it's much, much harder to recover endurance, okay? So you've heard the whole spiel. Basically, we're going to make those skill checks with the feat die and success dice equal to your value in there. Combat works basically the same way. There's some details for how you match up, but that'll be easy to go over when we actually have one in front of us, okay? Alright, so then I think we're basically ready to go, but what I will do is hand these sheets over to you to decide which one you want to play. Okay? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You're excited about that one. Alright, so yeah, fight amongst yourselves to get what you want. No, so go ahead and choose. And once you've done that, I think the best way to learn is to just go ahead and get started, and we'll give it a shot, okay? Alright. Everyone have a character? Doing good with your snacks and your tea? Great. Alright. Let's get started with our first adventure in the Shire.